But let me just begin on my left with Megan and ask just for a preliminary statement of your sense of what have the Democrats and Republicans walked away from this election, if you will, in the way of lessons or an understanding of what it means, and how do you suppose it is going to shape what we're likely to see in this town in the way of the staking out of legislative or policy positions or the movement on particular agendas? How do you think it's going to affect the governance landscape?
So I think that going into this election, a lot of people on the left especially expected that there was going to be a kind of seismic moment, a definitive, decisive message about what the country wanted, where the country was. And I don't think we got that. I think it's sort of interesting to me that if I were both parties, I would be taking a pretty humbling lesson away from this election. If I were Republicans, I would be taking away the lesson that Trump remains unpopular, that he lost seats in places that he needs to win in 2020, that there is no longer basically any way to really get legislation through unless you bring Democrats on board, something that seems pretty unlikely. And that now the House investigative committees are going to be open for business on looking into every nook and cranny of every single thing that Trump has done, just as Republicans did with Obama after they took the House. If I were a Democrat, I would be looking at this and saying, you know, the kind of resist movement, we've had an unprecedented wave of political activity in the past 2 years. We've had an unprecedented, especially if you're on the far left and you were hoping for a real seismic moment where you get the possibility of a left-wing politics that hasn't really existed in the United States since the 60s at least. And that a lot of people expected that. And that if I looked at that and I said, I didn't even get the Senate, yeah, it was a bad map, okay. Even so, I would be saying there was no possibility of that politics that I thought was possible until this midterm happened. And there are reasons for that. You can look at Brett Kavanaugh and how that produced, I think, to what had been a blue wave, I think what I called in a column a red undertow. We columnists always like to find little nifty phrases in the hopes that someone picks them up and immortalizes us. This has never happened to me yet, but I live in hope. But I think that the Kavanaugh investigation did produce this red undertow where it looked like Democrats had a good shot at the Senate, and then it looked pretty clear that they didn't after Kavanaugh. And the message I would take from that is that identity politics, which has been sort of the thing that the left has doubled down on for the past 2 years, after Clinton went farther in that direction again than any Democratic candidate has in a long time. The left could have said, okay, we need to step back, let's do the bread and butter issues. Instead, we really doubled down. We had Me Too, we had all of these waves of identity politics movements emanating from the grassroots. This is not a plan, but certainly people have been following that. And I think what you saw is that, yes, absolutely, these issues can really motivate your base. They can also motivate the other side. And so if I were a Democrat, I would be very worried that, after 2 years of incredible, unprecedented demonstrations, this was the best I could do. I could get an okay victory in the House. I couldn't even take the Senate. That would deeply worry me. But neither party seems to have taken those messages. Republicans are kind of like, well, we held the Senate. It just shows we're still okay. And Democrats are like, we got the House. See, we're doing great. And I don't think either party is doing great. And I think that the message coming away from here is that neither party has really had the kind of fundamental, holistic, and consistent rethinking of who they are yet. Right? There is no one who has a vision that seems like it can actually claim 50% plus one of the electorate and actually make them happy you're in office, as opposed to just terrified of the other people. We still don't have that. Neither party really seems to be looking for it. And I think that's kind of a worrying moment for America.
Ben, I'd like you to obviously offer any views you have and also respond if you like, and then I have some follow-up questions on what Megan just said.
So I think I largely disagree with that. I'm not sure about that, so the following is tentative. I'm not a political analyst, and so I don't actually, unlike Megan, I don't actually have any expertise on this particular question. But I actually think, first of all, seismic shifts in single off-year elections are extremely rare. and things that redefine political parties' visions of themselves, as she just described, actually require party leaders. And that party leaders don't emerge in that way in midterm elections. They emerge in presidential elections. And so I think, if you look at the margins by which certain Democratic incumbents lost, particularly in Indiana and Missouri and North Dakota, I think the lesson from that was that the Senate was actually never in play. So to me, the real takeaway, and I don't think Brett Kavanaugh was he may have been the icing on the cake, a sort of additional 2% on some of those states, but I don't think Heidi Heitkamp was ever seriously going to had a chance at re-election if you look at the margin by which she lost. And so I look at it and I say, this great Republican holding the line on the Senate, winning the Senate, whatever, amounted to a gain of 2 seats with a hugely favorable map. And they lost 40 seats in the House. And so I actually, I think if you measure it against the denominator of what was actually possible, I do not believe that there is much to smile about on the Republican side, and I do think there is a lot to be anxious about. And I think on the Democratic side, I agree that there are some troubling signs, like the inability to win Florida. By the way, the inability to win Georgia is not an especially troubling sign.
No, I think we agree on that.
No, and so if you think about presidential maps, the only really troubling sign, I suppose you can say the inability to win the Ohio governorship is a little troubling, and the inability to win Florida is a little troubling. That's 2 years after a surprising loss. And so I think the seismic shift, to the extent that you would expect to see it, you would expect to see it over 2 or 3 elections, not over one midterm election. And I think just as an analytical matter, as a down payment on that, I think the Democratic Party has a lot to smile about right now.
Sam, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Sorry for the late arrival.
No problem at all. Of course, everybody knows Sam Stein from the Daily Beast. And Sam, while you were gone, we started off with a splendid disagreement. Megan made the case that neither party is probably taking the right lesson away from the elections. Neither have a great deal to be excited about, but the Democrats, for all of the excitement, everything working in their favor, probably are patting themselves a little too violently on the back. Ben, however, goes the other way. And why don't we start? Because what we want to do is take what these parties
Wait, Ben, you think they're not patting themselves enough?
No, I think Bob was being a little bit. No, I think one side has much more to smile about than the other in this election, and it's not that I don't think that there are certain troubling warning signs for Democrats. I agree with that. I do think if you had said in November 10th of 2016, would you take this deal to Democrats, to the Democratic Party, the deal being what they got in November 2018, there would have been unanimous acceptance of that deal as a very good deal for the party. And if you'd asked the same question to the Republican Party, would you take the deal you got 2 years later, there would be unanimous rejection of the deal.
I think part of it depends on what your baseline is, right? If you start off thinking that Trump is kind of a fluke and is seriously unrepresentative, and it's a huge accident that he gets in, and that fundamentally voters really hate him, and they all hate him in large numbers, which I think was a baseline assumption of a lot of people, right? Like, we did not see that in this election. Now, if you started with your baseline as like, Democrats finished Obama Obama's term in like the worst position they'd been in since the 20s, and would they like to not be in that position? Yes, it is better than that, but it is not what you would expect from a like wholesale electorate rejection of Trump. They haven't. They like the fact that they couldn't take Florida is a bad sign. Yes, it was close. That's a bad sign because they have to take Florida in 2020.
Yeah, I guess I have a little bit more nuanced. I think I come closer to Ben on this. I think there are structural things that you have to throw into the mix here to explain the mixed result. One of them is there are difficulties and barriers erected towards voting that affected the outcome. The second is a more broader synopsis, which is we have an incredibly tribal political system in which people can self-rationalize supporting virtually anyone. They can abandon their previously held beliefs, their ideologies, in pursuit of the greater good of the party. And so that's something that I was taught a lot more after 2016, where I probably came down on your end, which was like, of course, they're going to have a wholesale rejection of this guy. And I quickly came to learn that you can rationalize a lot in pursuit of a political end. And so when I was thinking about 2018 before the vote happened, you know, the expectation was that we were going to diverge as a voting society, and that clearly is what happened in the midterm elections. You saw these rural results for Trump that almost matched what he had in the 2016 campaign, which is amazing for a midterm election. And then you had the suburban results for Democrats. And so ultimately, I think Democrats should be greatly relieved with what happened. And even that is not that great, because for the next 2 years, Trump will have carte blanche to reshape the judiciary. He will be able to stop any sort of major investigative movements in the Senate. And I think electorally, you have to obviously grapple with the fact that the Ohio governor's race stayed in Republicans and the Florida Senate and governor's race stayed with Republicans as well. But it's hard to also look at 2018 as anything other than a repudiation of Trumpism in at least the suburbs in some of these Southern Belt states, which would be something that Democrats could feel really good about.
I think that's actually really interesting, just that you've got now America's looking less regional, right? It's now
Totally.
actually, it's instead of being regional, it's kind of
There's like 500 different regions in America.
right. What kind of place do you live in? If you live outside of a city in the exurbs or beyond, you vote Republican. If you live in the suburbs or in a city, increasingly you vote Democratic. And that's really different, right? Southern suburbanites did not used to vote like northern suburbanites. Those used to be two very distinct electorates, and they look like they're converging. I don't know if that's good or bad. I mean, so first of all, if I were a Democrat, would I want to have urban and suburban voters more than exurban? Probably, but I mean, I think Nate Cohn of the New York Times had this great tweet on election night 2016 that has always stuck with me. He said the white working class, one way to think about this election is that the white working class started voting like a minority group, and they're 40% of the electorate. Right. And so I'm not really sure. Because like if they're really voting like a minority group with that level of real 80, 90% going into one class.
Well, it's complicated, right? Because the Senate map, it looks for the foreseeable future as if Democrats will have a real problem ever regaining the majority in the Senate. Even this current 2018 map, there are obviously opportunities for Democrats there, but they're not that great. And so you're left with a system in which perhaps the Senate stays in Republican hands for a long, long time, and the House stays in Democratic hands for a long time, and you have a divided government.
I don't know. I'm skeptical only because how many times have I watched? I wrote this in 2004, which was stupid, and then I watched successively. Right? I can't tell you how many times I was told in 2016 the Republicans were never going to have the presidency again. They had been demographically, it was just not possible, and so I hesitate to make predictions like that because the fact is political coalitions are unstable. They break apart. There are groups that I can really see leaving the Democrats. There are obviously groups like Southern suburbanites who I can really see leaving the Republicans. Do we end up with one party just having a majority? Not really clear to me.
I actually will make a prediction on this sphere, because I am old enough to remember the permanent Democratic majority in the House, the fact that after 2000, this city was awash with terms like the permanent Republican majority. And then I believe I believe it was around that time that Rui Tejera and John Judas wrote The Emerging Democratic Majority that was based on the origins of this demographic argument. And in 2008, we all did panels about how the Obama coalition was indestructible and the Republican Party was in eclipse. And
a rump party confined only to the South.
Yes, exactly.
Was my favorite.
And here's the truth of the matter: is we live in a two-party system, and in a two-party system, all claims that are made about the static nature of the current moment that make it permanent are always wrong, because the minority party at any given point adapts. And if you look at when Megan says the party coalitions are fluid, this is what I'm saying is a long-winded way of saying the same thing. If you lose enough elections, you stop putting up George McGovern, right? And the Democratic Party in the 90s was not the same thing as the Democratic Party in the late 60s and early 70s.
Yeah, but what's funny
and
about
the Republican
that,
Party today is really not the same thing as it was 8 years ago.
But I totally agree with that. But what's funny about that is that Republicans were in that let's adapt mode, right, after 2012. And what they ended up adapting to is the exact opposite way that the prescription called for.
I'm not making any comment about the direction of adaptation. I am saying that parties out of power adapt,
True.
and the result is that they find formulas that become winning for periods of time. And so whenever somebody looks around the country and says, oh, the blank dominance of this entity is permanent, the proper response is laughter. It just misunderstands the nature of our system. One other thing, I do think there is one other significant regional thing that's worth noting, which is, on election night, people really thought that this was a repeat of 2016, and the further you get away from the election, election night, the less true that looked. And the reason is that there actually is a regional effect going on, which is that Democrats did way better the farther west you go. And if you look at, and that's true in the Senate, where, if the early states that had returns that were contested were the most favorable to Republicans: Florida, Missouri, Indiana. And then as you go further west, you get into Nevada and Arizona, which are purpling very, very quickly. And of course, Texas was much more purple than people expected. And then you get into California, where there really was a Republican wipeout and in the House. And so I do think, I largely agree that we're less regional than we used to be. And the nature of, the sort of how far you live from a Whole Foods is a really interesting metric. Much more interesting metric than what part of the country you live in. On the other hand, it is really striking how much better Democrats did the further you go west, and how the trouble spots that Megan's talking about are all, southeast and Midwest.
I think that's right. I mean, I would just add to actually what you guys were saying, that it's totally true that the minority party adapts, but it's also true that the majority party runs into trouble. Right? Everyone knows this, right? Is that it's really fun.
Not this majority party.
It's really fun to be out of power, right? Because you can write all sorts of checks with your mouth that your butt is never going to have to cash. You can just talk about how great everything's going to be when you get into power and how terrible the other guys are. And then you get into, right? This is like the story of Obama, right? It was all a lot of fun to talk about stuff you could do. And then he got in, and it wasn't as much fun to try to do Obamacare as it was to talk about how great Obamacare would be once it was done. It looked a lot less, and this is not you can like Obamacare, you cannot, but Obamacare was not what anyone thought it was going to be. It was not what the architects thought it was going to be, and it was not what the voters, definitely not what the voters thought it was going to be, right? Because that's the reality of governing, is it's just what you produce policy-wise is never as nice as what you promise. And you run into problems with when you hold the majority, all of your coalition members, you've got a bunch of groups, and the Democrats, I think, have a somewhat bigger problem with this just because they have more groups, is that their interests don't coincide all the time. And you see this with what's going on with the Republicans, where you've got the kind of free market types who are just rejecting Trump, many of them, not all of them, but the evangelicals who are on board because of the Supreme Court, but then hate his morals. You have problems with trade-offs between what these groups want, and you have to start making them. And then eventually you make one of your coalition members angry, and some of them start to defect to the other party. And so, in fact, I just don't think, I think we're all agreeing, though, that, like, it's not stable, is that any idea that, like, the Republicans are always going to have the Senate or one party's always going to have the presidency. If you have been saying anything like that in the past 30 years, stop. It is now, like, been falsified so many times, it's embarrassing.
And I don't want to, I mean, you're the moderator, so you should end, but
Yeah.
I want to add one point here.
I'm obsolete.
If I can take some more time. To a degree, I would argue that the last election cycle was actually stable for Trump, which makes the coming one a little bit even more mysterious and dynamic. He had a really genuinely good economic record to run on. The Mueller report was ongoing, but it was in the background, and there was no results leaked from their end of the table. There were no serious in congressional investigations that were happening, nothing like what's going to happen now in the House. So those three dynamics were absent from the last election period, and all signs point to them being more dynamic in this election period, and we just don't know how that will play out. There is a case to be made that, in fact, it could produce sympathy and empathy for Trump among his voters, but there's also a case that it could create a serious amount of chaos that people find disruptive and annoying and want to vote out. So we're in for actually an even crazier election cycle, I feel like, this time.
This is like the question I have, and maybe one of you guys have the answers. I don't know if we have another Nixon moment. I'm not saying that we will. I'm not saying Mueller will find anything. I have no idea. This is so far outside of my wheelhouse, that kind of like foreign campaign donations and so forth. If he finds something, if we have another Nixon moment, right? The Nixon moment happened because he had a 66% disapproval rating. And then Republicans were like, if they impeach you, we're going to vote to remove you, so you should resign. And they cut a deal and he left, right? Would that happen again? I really don't know. Like, I don't know if the voters, I know what Republican politicians will do if he has a 66% approval and disapproval rating, but I don't know if the voters, we are a more polarized and partisan country than we used to be, but maybe others have a different opinion.
Well, let me bring sets the stage very well for asking the question. So how does this play out over the next several months in the city? Let me just begin and sort of what it means for how, and before we get to the investigations that may take place, the Democrats' conduct of oversight, before we get to that, one of the points that Henry Olsen made in his keynote address is that neither party, and you made a similar point, ever walks away from these things fully learning a lesson they probably should. The Republicans, for example, pushed very hard for a tax cut that, in Henry's words, was dead on arrival. It was never going to be the galvanizing political sort of tour de force that the Republicans had hoped that it would be. And on the other side, he argues, the Democrats ought to be consolidating their gains in the suburbs with former Romney voters, the so-called, Romney-Obama voters. But in fact, it looks like identity politics and other considerations within the party will drive them more aggressively to the left. So beginning with whatever comments you might want to make about what's taking place right now in the House in connection with Nancy Pelosi's bid to be reelected Speaker, how do you see the two parties sort of now, at least on this stage in Washington, setting up their legislative agenda or the direction of their policy debate to presumably maximize their positioning for 2020 and frame the public debate?
Oh my God, it's a lot. Is there any convergence here with the legislative agendas? I guess there theoretically could be an infrastructure bill and maybe something on opioids, and yeah, I honestly think the next 2 years will be, mayhem. What it will be is a lot of posturing, probably several government shutdowns. I don't think there will be a debt ceiling standoff because I don't think Democrats want to do that because they know how destructive that would be. But the idea that there's going to be some sort of bipartisan consensus on any dynamic issue is folly to me. I mean, they could try to make a run at immigration reform, but I have a feeling that Trump would rather have the issue than the policy. And so there's just not really an incentive base for them to cooperate at this point in time. You can make the case that Trump would benefit if he did that sort of triangulation like Clinton would have. Certainly if he did some of the more ceremonial stuff that a president's supposed to do, he might benefit. But what we've learned from the past 2 years is that's really not his instinct. I don't even think he likes it. I think he'd rather have the fight. And so for the next 2 years, I expect the fight, and I don't expect much legislative cooperation.
So I think whenever you're forecasting governance over time, it's always a good idea to try to reduce the conversation to a small number of the dominant salient variables, because we live in a world in which so many things are happening all the time and relatively few of them are determinative of anything. And so I think this situation is conditioned by 2 background conditions and 3, I don't know, you can call them variables or you can call them embedded if-then statements. And I just want to tick them all off and say that the answers to these questions will determine all the answers to the question that Bob posed without trying to answer it. So background condition number 1, which is always true, is that a foreign affairs crisis can upend everything I'm about to say at any time. And by the way, you may amplify that point because Trump's handling of foreign policy crisis is so idiosyncratic and peculiar that it adds a measure to uncertainty. But that's a general background condition. Background condition number 2, the increasingly in the modern era, the default outcome in Congress is always gridlock. And so there has to be something to generate action, or there will not be action. Those are the 2 general background conditions. Here are the 3 embedded if-then statements. The single dominant question that will determine everything is, what does Bob Mueller do and produce? If Bob Mueller produces something that something substantial to which Democrats need to respond, that will dominate. That will be the entire conversation. And people will say, "Oh yeah, and Medicare for all," or "Oh yeah, and infrastructure." But but those will be afterthoughts. We will have a, for those of you who, as I was unfortunate, I had to write the Washington Post editorials during the Clinton impeachment stuff. That was an all-consuming thing for the political system in 1998, 1999, 2000. And this will be that, only much more so. And it'll happen in the context of a presidential election, and it's all anybody's going to talk about. It'll suck all the air out of the room. And that is entirely up to Bob Mueller. By the way, it may have started today. Number 2, if that does not happen, and only if that does not happen, then you reach variable number 2, which is the personality of the president. Is he emotionally capable, and does he want to do what he calls deals? Right? So I actually don't know the answer to either of those questions. I suspect that the answer is he's not emotionally capable of it. And I really don't know the answer to the question is whether he actually wants it, because what he wants seems to change on a very, very rapid basis. If the answer to that question turns out to be yes, that is, Mueller doesn't occupy the field and the president wants and is emotionally capable of actually negotiating some deals, then you reach variable number 3. Variable number 3 is there an overlap of political interests that encompasses 3 groups of people: House Democrats, the president, and Mitch McConnell? People say Senate Republicans, but actually there's really not that many Senate Republicans that matter. Just as there aren't that many House Democrats that matter either. But Mitch McConnell, for example, there's a bipartisan criminal justice reform bill. It could get 70 votes in the Senate. It won't. And the reason is Mitch McConnell doesn't want to bring it up for a vote. And so you need, in order for something to happen, you actually need the overlap of the three-way overlap of that Venn diagram. That is conditional itself on whether the president, there's no doubt, by the way, that Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell are grown-ups enough to have a negotiation to figure out what the overlap of their Venn diagram is. It's totally unclear whether if you add the president in there, there's any overlap at all. And it's totally unclear that the president wants to even explore that in a significant way. So that's the way I would game it out. Ask yourself the question, is Mueller leaving enough space for there to be a political discussion about legislative priorities? If he is, do a sort of Rorschach test on the personality of the president and make a decision whether you think he's actually capable of having this discussion. And then and only then ask yourself the question, like, what does a deal look like? And my guess is, by the way, the only thing that occupies that possible space is infrastructure, because at the end of the day, lots of members of Congress like to have the federal government pay for roads.
I will actually start by answering that. I think it's obvious he can't make a deal. He couldn't make a deal with his own caucus. He had control of the Senate and the House and couldn't make a deal on health care, right? Like, this is like, in the words of P.J. O'Rourke, like doing real estate dog deals with your dog, right? Like, beachfront, you don't want beachfront, Fido? I've got a dump right here. It's bones, rats, you'll love it. We'll trade you straight up, right? He can't do it. He doesn't want to make a deal. He likes to talk. I think there's no overlap. I think there's overlap on infrastructure, but there's no money for infrastructure, so luckily that's not a problem. And the rest of it, immigration, what's the overlap? Democrats are trending towards open borders, Republicans are trending towards like autarky. So what do you do a deal with between that? Like, we will not let any immigrants in, but we also won't deport any?
Yeah, but how do you really feel?
What?
I said, yeah, but how do you really feel?
No, I think, but what I think the next 2 years is mayhem from Trump, probably unless something happens with Mueller, and I don't think any of us know. If anyone does, see me afterwards. I'll be anonymous.
See me first.
I'll bake you a cake.
I'll bake you 2 cakes.
But which one of us has a food blog, Sam? So, we don't know, but aside from that, and what I think is interesting, right, is that in some way, the battleground is going to be the suburbs, I think. It's, can Republicans get back some of their suburban voters? And yet, what is, as I think Olson is right, Democrats are not going after those voters at all, because suburban voters are kind of liberal in cultural war issues, but they're really conservative about, like, the New York Times had an article, I hate to mention our competition, twice in one session, but they had an article talking about suburban voters, and this is exactly right. They are parents, they are taxpayers, and they are homeowners, and if you do anything that threatens any of those things, if you ask them to pay higher taxes, if you do anything that would make them send their kids to school with poorer kids, or if you, like, do anything that threatens the value of their home, they will turn on you with the white-hot fury of 1,000 suns. And that's not really where I see the Democrats going right now. I also think that you have seen some of this stuff with, like, the Me Too stuff, where it turns out that middle-aged women are not as on board as young millennial women, and that had not been apparent until the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, that there were a lot of middle-aged women who are married to the guys whose jobs you want to take away, and that has turned out to be a complication.
I would disagree with that.
But
we can debate that.
It is a theoretical point, but I think I'm on solid ground here. But so where the parties are at this point is kind of enabling each other to be as extreme and unappealing as possible to the median voter, right? I mean, like, essentially, I think that Trump is empowering Democrats to not care, right? He is empowering them to feel like he is so awful that I could be basically like, we're gonna nationalize the coal mines and your internet and, like, but I'm not Trump, so vote for me. And I think that Republicans feel the same way. And it's a real difference if you take two kind of canonical figures, take FDR and then Reagan. And you think about how hugely popular these guys were, right? Like, I believe Mondale did not even carry his home state, or he only carried his home state.
100,000 votes.
Right. He did really badly in '84, right? And this is, people loved Reagan. You know, partly they're like giving him credit for economic growth he didn't have that much to do with, but hey, you know, everyone gets credit when it goes well and doesn't get credit when it goes badly, and it's not really fair on either side. But these guys built enduring legacies within a party for generations, right? People still talk about FDR on the Democrats. People still talk about Reagan, and that has faded as the people who remember him die. But there's still very powerful influences, and you can see that in that, like, Republicans' big idea during the Trump term was like a Reagan rerun. And we don't have any figure like that today. What we have, in fact, is this feeling that, well, okay, they're moving farther left, so that means I get to move farther right and not care so much, because what are you going to do? Vote for the communist? And vice versa. What are you going to do? Vote for the fascist? And that's actually kind of bringing out this really interesting politics that is extremely unpredictable. Because do voters hate that or that more is a much harder question than do voters like this or not like it, right? And so I think that we are in for an incredibly volatile electoral cycle for the next 2 years, that very little is going to be done legislatively. Not much is going to happen on the regulatory front, just because Trump has really never gotten his act together. He's in charge of it. He just can't figure out how to control it. And that 2020 is going to be a lot about, like, who are you more afraid of? And who are, most importantly, who are people in the suburbs more afraid of? And we think we know the answer now. I'm not sure we do. I think that could turn around in 2020, depending on what the people who are running are saying in order to win the primary, which is a very different election from the general. You know, I mean, Trump only carried the primary because the field was so fractured that no one else could consolidate. If there had been one candidate early, he would never have gotten the nomination in the first place. But having done so, I think he has encouraged Democrats to think that that is the way to go.
Let me ask you a question before I do want to get back to what Ben said about, quote, it's up to Bob Mueller. I want to talk about the congressional response, because I'm still trying to get back to the legislative process, and as we have been for the last few minutes. H.R. 1 in the House, the first, as I understand it, legislative initiative is going to be centered on process reforms. It's going to involve questions like campaign finance reform, gerrymandering, ethics reform in the House, and so forth. Do you see that having that sort of reformism having any impact beyond, say, the usual constituency for it in the Capitol? Is there anything you draw, any conclusion you draw from the Democrats having staked that line, that position out initially as a new majority in the House of Representatives?
It's a really good question. I think the first question is why make that the first priority, right?
Correct.
Why do you think they made it the first priority?
I'm asking you.
No, you're right. You're the moderator. I think it's because it's all-encompassing. It not only gets at people's fears of Trumpism and Trump himself, but also gets at the Democratic critique of how politics is structured and the inherent unfairness of some of politics writ large, so voting rights, gerrymandering, and so on and so forth. So if you're going for one big idea, that encompasses everything. It's not, I mean, they ran on, the main idea in the election was protecting pre-existing conditions, but by sheer fact that they got elected and now control the House, those will theoretically be protected. Of course, Trump could do some shenanigans with executive authorities, but now the other question is, will it matter? And I think the federal stuff will be largely ceremonial. I don't think, there's specific rules changes to how the chambers will operate that may matter, but I think the messaging will be ceremonial. I think where you'll see actual movement on these issues is in the states, and it's going to be a state initiative for progressives mainly, and that's including things like automatic voter registration, educating people about gerrymandering and when it will happen again after the 2020 census, things like that. It's going to be piecemeal, and there are going to be some states that have progress, and there are going to be some states that don't. And so I get it as a messaging tool for the Democrats. I don't think it will be it won't move the ball forward significantly. I think you're going to have to see that happen outside of Washington.
I think so I largely agree with that. I think there are a few elements of this particular set of process reforms that are, messaging elegance from a Democratic point of view, which relates to my earlier point that the default position of Congress is always inaction for gridlock reasons, right? So you're not actually going to get anything done on these issues because you don't have the Senate, and even if you had the Senate, you wouldn't have 60 votes in the Senate. On the other hand, there are relatively few issues in which that you can appeal to a great many segments of your coalition. Voting rights is one of them, right? And so for the good government types, it's gerrymandering reform, right? For a lot of minority voters, what happened in Georgia is a real, and by the way, rightly so, is a really shocking thing. And that sort of restriction on voter access in the name of voting security and anti-fraud measures is, prevented a lot of people from voting. And that has been a mounting confrontation over a long period of time. And then in addition, there are the Voting Rights Act, both the Shelby County components of it, but also the reauthorization side. So I mean, there's a set of issues before you get to internal processes within the House, right, that really address a large number of base elements of the party. And by the way, the merits of some of these issues are quite different from one another. But since you're not actually going to pass anything anyway, the merits don't actually matter very much. What matters is you get to show that you're doing something. There's limits to how much that works, actually. Paul Ryan passed a huge amount of legislation through the House that didn't go anywhere in the Senate, and it turns out that stuff did not actually energize a whole lot of Republican voters. And like passing stuff through one house of Congress is like a neat trick if you're Speaker of the House, but it actually doesn't do very much. On the other hand, to show that you're doing something on day one, having a broad-based piece of legislation that puts the other side in a difficult position and appeals to lots of different constituencies within your own base, it's not a bad play. It leaves something very unsatisfying, which is, okay, it's not actually going to get anything done on any of those issues. It's simply territory marking. And we have a lot of that in the political system right now, and that is a function of the fact that because nobody believes you can actually pass any legislation, people don't think about what legislation can we actually pass. They think about what legislation can we put forward to make the other side look bad and to satisfy elements of our base, which of course makes it hard to pass legislation. So I totally understand why they're doing this. I think it's probably the right move for them under the circumstances, but it is part of a prisoner's dilemma in which the first branch of government basically sucks.
So I would observe a few things. The first is that we are in an era when Congress is turning over more than any time it has since the 19th century, by which I mean that changes which party controls it, right? Certainly Benjamin and I, Sam, you're a little younger, but we grew up in an era where Democrats had just run things forever, right? There was a great story about the Speaker of the House. I don't know if this is actually true, but when Tom Foley lost office, that the people in his district just thought that whoever they elected would be Speaker of the House, and they were surprised to find out that it was an elected. So I do not know. So I've always loved that story. But so because of that, right, you have a dominant party and a minority party. And first of all, ideologically, they're not nearly so sharply divided. But second of all, if you know the Democrats are just going to keep being in power, so you find ways to cut deals and get what you need for your district, take it home and be like, I did this thing, right? The problem is, if at any time you, in the next 2 years, you might control Congress, you have an incentive to be like, no, I'm not going to cooperate with them and help them get reelected. No, I'm going to wait. And then when I have it all, I'm going to do everything and not let them have anything, right? And that is the mentality that dominates Congress now. Everyone's just waiting for the next time when they control the whole.
Well, isn't even more pernicious? It's if you dare to help them, you risk your own seat,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. I mean, there's also that, right? Is that you're totally afraid that like it'll come with an ad of like, you know, who was the guy who got photographed hugging Obama and then got in trouble?
Charlie Crist?
Yes, right. Like, and it was totally banal. Like it was hurricane relief, but no, you got photographed too close to Obama, and that was a disaster. Even though he'd been getting money for his state, right? This is crazy stuff, and so because of that, nothing's going to happen, right? There's no incentive for anyone to cooperate. And there hasn't been for roughly 15, 20 years. So I think that is the other thing that I think we need to remember is that like no one knows outside of Washington what these guys are doing. Like we talk about all the investigations is a big deal and like the legislation they're passing day one, right? Do you know how many people even know the name of their congressman, right? They go in and they vote a ticket. I mean, they were probably, you know, lots of people voted for Democrats because they were mad at Trump, and fair enough. But my point is, like, having done that, they're not like home, oh, I'm going to open the newspaper and see what they're doing to get Trump. No, they're like, I expressed myself. Now there's Kids Little League, and I'm up for a promotion at work. They're not paying any attention. So like we all talk about this is that this is super important, and they're putting out markers and they're making, and the fact is that like this is going to affect a tiny number of political junkies who actually pay any attention whatsoever to what Congress is doing when it is not like something really high profile, like a big confirmation hearing or impeachment or some big vote like the like TARP. They just aren't paying attention at all, and so what they're not doing. What they are doing instead of doing something actually legislative, it's so marginal. I mean, like, it's nice that they have something to do with their days, but honestly, like, it's not going anywhere, and it's also not going to make a huge
Let me add
difference
to,
in the
I want to
elections.
tell just a quick story about Elkhart, Indiana, if I may. Is that okay? Because I think it illuminates a lot
I
of
was about
this.
to ask about Elkhart.
I figured. Mind meld here. But it's not that they're not even paying attention. I would argue that what Congress does, they may even notice, but it doesn't really matter. And so the reason I say that is Elkhart, Indiana is a very interesting story. I know Anita probably is familiar with Elkhart, because it was such an important place in the Obama presidency and pre-presidency even. He went there during the recession. Elkhart's unemployment was 20%. It's the RV capital of the world. No one buys RVs during recessions. I don't know why they buy them during non-recessions, but no one's buying RVs. And so he goes there and he makes the pitch and he sells the Stimulus Act and he passes the Stimulus Act, and the Stimulus Act helps Elkhart, Indiana. And by the end of his presidency, he goes back to Elkhart and unemployment's down to 3%. And I called all these people in Elkhart, Indiana who'd received stimulus money because their lives had been made demonstrably better by it. And basically, no one thought they had gotten stimulus money. They all were shocked to find out it was from the stimulus. So that's to your point. They're all shocked. They're like, this is a government loan from the state, or there's no way that came from Obama. And a bunch hung up the phone on me. And then now Elkhart is really important again because you need steel to build RVs, and we have these steel tariffs. And suddenly, the people of Elkhart are really nervous about their economy because the price of producing an RV's gone up, and future sales, I should say, not current sales, but future sales, their forecasting is going down. And I called up people in Elkhart, Indiana again, and no one seemed to be totally upset with Donald Trump, even though these tariffs had threatened their bottom line. And so the reason I tell the story is because I think, obviously, what happens in Washington matters, and it affects people's lives. But I don't know if it totally affects their voting behaviors.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of other features out there that will cause people to vote.
Let me just mention, by the way, there are people going up and down the aisles here who will take questions, or we'll give you cards on which to write questions,
Yes.
and we have them. As a matter of fact, a good number of them. Before we do, I just have to ask the Mueller question, because again, I want to relate it back to Congress. So, Mitch McConnell has made it very clear, speaking of the party of one in the Senate, that he has no interest in legislation to protect Mueller from being dismissed, from being fired. There is a view that for a variety of reasons, it's going to take a lot to break the Republican support for Trump. A lot, that is to say, in the investigation, to upset or undermine Republican support for Trump. Do you think that, because you mentioned we may be seeing the beginning of the sort of major, the climax of all of this here, do you think that is true, and that we're now in a situation in which there isn't such a thing as a tipping point for the Congress, so that in effect what you'll have is more of what you just described, which is a highly angry, aroused Democratic majority in the House that will be consumed with this, but Republicans who will dig in, and this just will simply drag on? Do you think would that apply, just to add one more fact to the pattern, would that apply if, say, for example, the president began to not so much threaten to fire Mueller, but actually acted on some of the suggestions he's made that he would pardon key witnesses? Is this situation so different from the example that you gave earlier, Megan, of Watergate, where at some point the Republicans come, I think you talked about that, and they say to the president, this is just too much?
All right, so I was talking to Mueller about this yesterday. That's a joke.
Boy, Megan, you got to start baking more cakes.
I make a very, very fine salted caramel chocolate cake. Well, I'm just saying.
Yeah, so, all right, I actually have a view of this that is, I think, quite divergent from the conventional wisdom, which is that there is, a strong floor to the president's support, and it's completely immune to events. And I actually do not believe that. And I want to describe an event that I think will test the conventional wisdom on this. And I'm not at all confident that the president's support will not at that point defy the conventional wisdom. The president's lawyers are telling every journalist who will listen that Bob Mueller is writing a report. Now, that's a complicated proposition, and what exactly it means, and what kind of report he might be writing. And by the way, the president's lawyers may not be in the best position to know the answers to that question, and they have a propensity to talk out of orifices other than their mouths anyway. So, there's a lot of reasons to treat that stream of reporting with a grain of salt. That said, the regulation under which Mueller serves requires that he write a final report. And if you believe, as I believe, that the president has committed a number of offenses that somebody in Bob Mueller's shoes would reasonably regard as potentially impeachable, there may be a serious set of questions that he has to think about what parts of his information he may have an obligation to transmit to Congress, which was something that both Ken Starr and Leon Jaworski, a problem they confronted as well and handled, by the way, slightly differently from one another. Now imagine a report that lays out all of it. Leave aside the classified stuff, but lays out in meticulous detail both everything we believe, because press has kind of reported on it in general terms. We don't have kind of chapter and verse on it, and also a lot of stuff that we didn't know. So the prosecution today, the plea of Michael Cohen, is a really interesting example of this. 6 months ago, BuzzFeed News, two extremely fine reporters there, put out this, I don't know, it must have been 10,000 word story about the history of Trump Tower. Almost everything that's in this document today is in that story. Not everything, almost everything. So ambiently, the political culture kind of had access to this information already. And by the way, in a really well-reported, well-annotated story that you had every reason to have confidence in, the political system didn't care at all. Like, it just kind of rolled over it, and BuzzFeed ran a story, so what? Today's move with Michael Cohen is a big, big deal, right? And it's Bob Mueller saying largely, and Michael Cohen admitting, what we already knew. So imagine a huge amount of that
Ben,
stuff.
you might want to say what that is, because some people may not be aware.
Oh, I'm sorry. So if people... So what happened? Yeah, so Michael Cohen admitted to having lied to the House Intelligence Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee about when the Trump Tower Moscow deal was actually in negotiation. And it turns out, he now admits, that well into the summer of 2016, that is, while he was, the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party heading into the Republican National Convention, around the same time that the Trump Tower New York meeting happened and the Russians start dumping emails into the public, Hillary Clinton's emails, the president is negotiating to build Trump Tower Moscow with the president of Russia. That's the allegations that Michael Cohen admitted to today. I'm exaggerating a little bit, not very much. Imagine a huge amount of that material. The stuff that is all out there, you can find it if you can find it in the media. It doesn't have the US government's name behind it. And then imagine all the stuff that we don't know yet, that you kind of know in your bones may well be true. And imagine it all comes out in a very methodical, just the facts kind of way. I do believe that is a game-changing moment. Now, I don't know that I think such a report is actually, going to materialize. So I'm not saying that that's, what's going to happen next week. I am saying I don't subscribe to the view that if such a thing were to happen, the political system would shrug and all Senate Republicans would be like, well, I don't read the tweets, or I look at what the president does, not what he says. These sort of, and I do think there are certain things like that are sufficiently disruptive, and that it's a little bit like the little child saying in the parade that the emperor has no clothes, and it may be the thing that we all know, but I don't think. And by the way, an example of that is the Khashoggi stuff, right? Where at one level, the political system could sort of absorb this, but when the president issued that statement, the political system actually couldn't absorb that easily. And yesterday's vote is a reflection of that.
I would like to think that there's no floor. Right?
You would like to think, pardon me?
I would like to think that there's no floor on what the political system will accept. But I I am, I think, safe to say, by a considerable margin, the most conservative person on this floor. And so I have a lot of conservative readers. And I was horrified by Trump. We at Bloomberg, I was at Bloomberg at the time. We at Bloomberg did not endorse, so I did not officially endorse a candidate. I did, however, write the column right before the election that said, "Do not give this man nuclear weapons." A column for which I'm still taking kidding from people who say, "So, we haven't had a nuclear holocaust." But
Yet.
Well, anyway, I will not go into the subtle details of why I still stand by that column. But so I had a lot of conservative readers, and they just accuse me of Trump derangement syndrome every time I criticize him. Right? And I don't want to say not unfairly. The media has gone completely over the top. And there has been some borderline irresponsible reporting along with a lot of great reporting. There has been, people react to things, even to things that are normal, and they freak out because Trump, and then we find out that the same thing happened in the Obama administration. There's just enough examples of those things that my conservative readers can dismiss it as, well, you guys are just, you've lost your minds, right? And so like the Khashoggi thing is a good example. I think if this had happened under Bush, we would all have joined together in one large blob of outrage. And now my readers are just like, why do you journalists think you're so special? And I'm like, you guys have been reading me for like 15 years. Why are you telling me this? I think I'm special. Thank you. I do not wish to be killed by a foreign government. And so the problem is this information comes out. How do we get it to the voters? How do we get it to the people who we're attempting, right? They don't trust us. And in fact, at some level, right, they're right. The media is liberal and is biased against conservatives, and it does not treat conservatives fairly. It considers anything a conservative does worse than a liberal doing the same thing. That is true. But it is not true that we therefore like fabricate stuff. It's all incredibly subtle. It's choice of emphasis. It's what are you personally outraged about? But they've picked up on just enough of it that they fundamentally do not trust the media. They fundamentally no longer trust the FBI, which is shocking. When we're conservatives not liking the CIA and the FBI, they don't trust anyone who says anything bad about Trump. So where do you get the information that is supposed to convince the voters? Because I will tell you, I do not believe that unless you convince the voters, you will get the Republicans to turn tail. Maybe, right? Like I would like to think that Republicans would just stand up and be like, no, enough is enough. You cannot do this. I don't care if I lose office. I'm not letting this happen to my country. Have I seen evidence in the last 2 years that that's what's going to happen? Not really. And so I'm not sure that I think that a big report by Mueller, I think we will spend a lot of time being outraged and saying if it's really bad, saying he should be impeached and whatever, and like I will say those things too. But I don't know that they are going to translate into anything, because as long as Republicans hold the Senate, you cannot remove him from office unless a 2/3 majority of them want him removed from office. Getting to that 2/3 majority is a huge hurdle. And the one thing that I do not think is going to happen is that I do not think that Trump will leave office voluntarily no matter what. I think if they go to him and say, we have a 2/3 of the votes and like we are taking you out of office tomorrow, he will stay to the bitter end. And so like I would like to think that this matters a lot. It will certainly matter morally, and it will be important, like it will be truth and so forth, but I don't know that it matters politically, because I don't know that Republicans will abandon him. I think they're now so angry about elites and at elites. They don't trust anything that any elite says. And that's why they voted for Trump, and that is why it is going to be extremely hard to remove him, even if he turns out to have committed high crimes and misdemeanors.
So I don't disagree with any of that, and I want to sort of narrow the scope of the apparent disagreement here. First of all, when Nixon left office, he had 25% approval rating. So there's a 25%, like in 1974, there is a floor. And actually, if you guys remember Father Guido Sarducci, the comedian Joe Novello, one of his personalities was this guy Laszlo Toth. When he wasn't playing Guido Sarducci, he was playing this guy Laszlo Toth, who was one of the Nixon bitter enders and used to write comic letters to Spiro Agnew, telling him to stay and fight. So like the Nixon bitter ender was a real thing, and it was 25% of the population. George W. Bush left office with 35% approval rating, 36%, something like that. Donald Trump has been floating between 37 and 43 for essentially the entirety of his presidency. So when I say it may be possible to break through the floor, I'm not talking about breaking through to zero. I'm talking about breaking through, is it possible to break through to the level that George W. Bush was at when he left office? Is it possible to break through to the level that Nixon was at when he left office? We're talking about 7, 8, 10, 15% of the electorate, not the whole of it. That's point number one. Point number two is I hope what I was saying was not understood to be either advocacy of his removal or suggestion that anything sort of short of that is the goal. My point was an analytical one about the question of whether the current stability of his approval is quite as fixed as it looks. And I actually think the question of whether impeachment and removal is a desirable outcome in this environment is a very complicated one, and I lean toward the idea that it is not a desirable outcome, though I do believe he has committed impeachable offenses.
Let me actually also clarify, which is that I don't want him impeached today. I can certainly imagine that the Mueller report would come back with things that would cause me to call for his impeachment, but I do not have any reason to know that he should be impeached today. I am not pleased with him as a policymaker, and I don't like the way he talks. But I also think that there's phenomenal damage that could be done to the polity by just removing him from office because I don't like him, which is essentially like a lot of kind of advocacy that I hear is like, he's so horrible, he should be removed no matter what. I get it. I think that he does very destructive things. But I also think it would be very destructive to just pull him out of office.
Sam?
No, I want to get the questions. Let's do the.
Okay, so here's what I was going to say about the questions. The questions are very much focused on the 2020 elections and on politics, so I'm going to turn them over momentarily to David Axelrod and make sure he gets them answered so they won't be ignored. And that's why I'm holding on to them.
Okay.
Because they're not so much geared to some of what we're talking about here. Much of it is about where the Democrats need to go in 2020, what kind of candidates would be, and so forth. And nobody better than David Axelrod to take it up from there. But did you have a further comment about sort of how this plays out here in town and the way in which the Republicans may or may not be, if you will, just simply stuck with a Republican electorate that's going to stick much longer than we think it might with the president?
Sure. So I think I come down basically in the same zone where you guys ended up. I would only add a couple different things to it, which is I'm not entirely convinced that Mueller will matter more than the economy. I think if the economy turns sour, that could dissuade a lot of his Republican voters. So that's another factor. And then the other thing is we can't have this conversation really fully without acknowledging the role that Fox News and conservative media plays in this debate. We have a media organ that is, for better or worse, a cheerleader for the president in whatever he does. And it just so happens that that's this cable operation that most Americans watch. And they have proven incredibly willing to give him cover for things that they would never have given cover to anyone else before. I don't know if that ever gets broken. And I think that even in the issuance of a Mueller report, which will be fought tooth and nail by Rudy Giuliani, but even in the issuance of that report, I think there's a reality in which the Sean Hannitys and Tucker Carlsons of the world basically concur with the president that it's fake and partisan and written by 13 angry Democrats and yada, yada, yada. And are we in this media ecosystem, are we in this political ecosystem where that is persuasive enough to voters to allow Trump to see his way through it? Nixon never had that. I mean, he didn't. Trump does. And that's a huge variable that I don't think we've really accounted for.
Can I just
Of course.
just add a note to that? So, for my sins in life, I ended up, playing a small role in the events around Jim Comey's firing. And, I do think, having gone through that experience, that the moment where people who are sort of stolid and of significant reputation go up to Congress and tell the truth is a very powerful moment. And Jim definitely fell into that category. He went up to Congress, among other things, carrying a lot of baggage. And Bob Mueller doesn't carry that baggage. He doesn't carry any of it. And he has assiduously used his own silence as a way of hoarding moral authority and credibility. That is both a personality-driven thing, it's kind of who he is. It's also strategically very smart. And the day that Bob Mueller decides to talk, most people don't know what his voice sounds like. You know, the other day I was at the FBI Agents Association dinner, and they showed a little video, and it had Bob Mueller in it. He'd done a little interview to support the FBI Agents Association. And I tweeted the video. And people were stunned that, oh, that's what his voice sounds like.
What does it sound like?
High, squeaky, right?
No, it's like kind of like what you would imagine Bob Mueller's voice to sound like, actually.
I don't think I've ever actually met, like, my fantasy life is obviously impoverished.
I mean, you know, the day that that report happens, if it ever happens, and Bob Mueller goes up to Congress to talk about it, don't underestimate the power of that moment. And there are very few people in the United States who have genuine moral authority, legal authority, and stature. And when those people speak, I mean, like, imagine that Jim Comey had gone up for that June testimony and nobody had had a question about the way he'd handled the Hillary Clinton email thing, right? And he was reporting on the contents of an investigation. That's a very powerful moment.
I don't want to be so cynical, because I think you're right in that Bob Mueller is a unique figure in his silence and his unwillingness to participate in this circus. But an honestly question for you, do you see a reality in which he goes up to the Hill and he delivers these findings in a sober-minded, stoic fashion, and that night, the Fox News evening programming is anything other than, why didn't he ask this person this question? What about the conflicts of the people on his team? Why does this report not look at, you know, GPS fusion and the role it played? And, you know, all the sort of little tidbits of doubt that Trump's tried to sow in the national discourse over the past 2 years. I can't see a reality in which even Bob Mueller comes out and the conservative media programming is willing to just play it straight with that.
I tend to agree with that, but I also think that there are game-changing moments in our politics even now. I mean, 9/11 is was a genuine game-changing moment, and a lot of things changed. Granted, on a relatively short-term basis politically, but there were 6 months where it was, you know, kind of not okay to not agree about a whole lot of things. And, you know, the Great Recession, the crash, the financial crisis was a game-changing moment. It ended the Bush presidency ended, you know, because he left office. But the moral end of the Bush presidency was when, you know, in that period. And so I don't mean when I say the bottom falls out that we fall out to zero. But do I think that life could get super uncomfortable, that Fox News broadcast that you're describing could ring hollow to a lot of people who now rally to it? Yeah, I do. And I think there's more fluidity to our, you know, apparently rigid political divisions than we sometimes like to imagine.
I will also say that, I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting for me is that in general, with exceptions, like a lot of, let me say this a different way, a lot of conservative media figures behaved way better about Trump than I expected. Way better. These people have suffered major financial losses, right? And like, you know, I actually think they don't get nearly enough credit. These were people who stood up and said no to Trump, lost contracts, lost book deals, lost readers, et cetera, like, and they took that hit. And so I guess the hope is like, look, if it's really bad, and they took that hit because that was fundamentally what they believed in, right? And the hope is that, look, if it's bad enough, do people in Fox say, like, no, I won't go there? Right? No, I can't do this? Like, quite possibly. I don't know any of those guys well enough to speak to their character, but I have watched so many people stand up for what they believed in against their own financial interest, against what their readers wanted to hear, that, like, I have hope that more people would, if it is convincing enough. But it has to be convincing enough. It can't be, well, this one guy, but he's kind of dodgy, and then someone else said something different.
Right.
It has to be a slam dunk. But if it's a slam dunk, let's end on a less cynical note, which is that I have hope for America, and I have hope for the movement.
That is a good note on which to end, as this was, for my part, one of the absolute best panels I've ever sat through, which is why you noted largely silence on my part. And I can't thank these panelists enough. We burned into the period we were going to set aside for a break, but that seems to be fine because we're going to bring David Axelrod and his panel in immediately, and we'll get to the questions that we set aside. But in the meantime, I can't say enough how appreciative I am of the quality of this conversation. Thank you.